All right, are we ready to get started? All right, so thank you for a wonderful presentation. Hopefully, I think there's already a whole bunch of questions coming in. While those are rolling in, I've got a couple primer questions here. And I was hoping you could tell the audience how you actually became a Christian, or what was your journey to faith?
Happy to say, I was not raised in a Christian home, as you were, John, but in a good, loving home, but not a church-going family. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask the big questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And in the search for answers, I began to attend a large church in our community. The only problem was, instead of answers, what I found was a social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate, and the other high school kids who pretended to be such good Christians on Sunday lived for their real God the rest of the week, which was popularity. And this really bothered me because I thought, I feel so spiritually empty inside, but I'm living externally, at least, a better life than they are, and they claim to be Christians. They must just be as empty as I am, but they're all putting on a false front. They're all a pack of hypocrites. And so I began to become very alienated toward the institutional church. And soon this attitude spread toward other people as well. Everybody, I thought, is a hypocrite and a fake and not really authentic. And so I shunned relations with other people. I threw myself into my studies. I said, I don't need people. I don't want people. I want nothing to do with them. And yet, in moments of honesty and introspection, when I looked into my own heart, I knew that deep down inside, I really did want to love and to be loved. And that therefore, I was just as much a hypocrite as they were, because here I was putting on this false front, pretending not to need people, when deep down inside, I knew I really did. And so that anger I felt toward them turned in on myself for my own hypocrisy and phoniness. And I don't know if you understand what this is like, but this kind of inner anger just eats away at your insides, making every day miserable, another day to get through. And I remember one day I walked into my high school German class and I was feeling particularly crummy. And I sat down behind a girl who is one of these types that was always so happy it just made me sick. And I tapped her on the shoulder and she turned around and I said to her, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, it's because I'm saved. And I said, you're what? And she said, I know Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. And I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, what would he want to do a thing like that for? And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was so filled with anger and bitterness inside. And she said there was someone who really loved me. And who was it but the God of the universe? And that thought just staggered me, that the God of the universe could love me, that worm named Bill Craig down there on that speck of dust called planet Earth. I just couldn't take it in. Well, I went home that night and I found a New Testament that had been given to me in the 5th grade when the Gideons visited our elementary school. And for the first time, I opened it and began to read. And as I read the Gospels, I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a wisdom about this man's teaching that was undeniable, and especially there was an authenticity about his life that wasn't characteristic of those people who claimed to be his followers in that local church I was attending. And I realized then I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, to make a long story short, I went through about 6 months of the most agonizing soul searching that I've ever been through. And at the end of those 6 months, I just came to the end of my rope and one night cried out to God. And I just cried out all the anger and the bitterness that had been building up inside of me. And as I did, I felt this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. And I rushed outside. It was a warm Midwest September evening, and you could see the Milky Way from the horizon to horizon. And as I looked up at the stars, I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment changed my whole life, because I had thought enough about this during those 6 months to realize that if Bill Craig ever became a Christian, that I could do nothing less than devote my entire life to spreading this message among mankind. Because if this is really the truth, if it's really the truth, this is the greatest news ever announced. And so for me, my call to vocational Christian ministry was simultaneous with my conversion.
Thank you. That's a powerful story. Yeah.
Thank you.
Here's the first question. What would you say has been the most challenging topic you've ever had to discuss to defend the faith?
Probably, honestly, the origin of life that I talked about tonight. This is the result of some recent research that I've done. And I don't have very good training in chemistry. I had high school chemistry, and that was about it. So this really was a steep learning curve for me to study organic chemistry and the origin of life scenarios. I was helped in this by consultation with professional origin of life scientists at Rice University and at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. I wanted to develop a theological perspective on the origin of life. And that was, I think, probably one of the most challenging areas that I've ever studied.
What about defending? Any argument or something that has been the most challenging to defend?
Well, I think perhaps the so-called hiddenness of God is the best objection that the skeptic can raise. And that is to say that God, if he exists, could have made his existence a whole lot plainer, right? I mean, he could have written his name in the stars, or put a neon cross in the sky saying Jesus saves, or even in more subtle ways, God could make his existence a lot less hidden. And yet he's chosen to create us at a sort of arm's length where his existence is not evident. And somebody might say that the reason that God is hidden is because there's nobody there. And so the challenge for the Christian would be to offer some sort of explanation for God's hiddenness. And I would say several things about it. Number one, I think on the basis of evidence such as we view tonight, and that's only partial, there's a lot more, God's existence is not really all that hidden. He has manifested himself in clear ways, I think, in the world that allows us to see that he is there. Second, it's important to keep in mind that God's purpose is not simply to get people to believe that he exists, to add one more item to their inventory of what exists. Rather, it is to bring people into a personal love relationship with himself. And I think it is perfectly plausible that in a world in which there was a neon cross in the sky or God's name written on every atom, that although people might believe that he exists, there's no reason to think that this would lead to more people coming to know him and his salvation and find eternal life. Just the obviousness of God's existence doesn't produce heart change. You see that over and over again in the Old Testament, where the Israelites, despite the pillar of fire and smoke, the parting of the Red Sea, the various miracles, fell away time and time again from God. So I think that God has created us at a kind of distance from himself to create a hunger in those whose hearts want to know God so that they search for him and approach him with humility and an attitude of seeking that is conducive to finding this kind of personal love relationship with himself. And so I trust in God's wisdom in the obviousness with which he's disclosed himself to us.
Fantastic. All right, let's keep going. Piggybacking off the lecture this evening, how old do you think the Earth is?
4.8 billion years.
Any one or two sentence reason why?
That's what the best evidence indicates. And those kind of numbers used to seem big until I started thinking about the national debt and the infrastructure bill. And now, the age of the universe, it's 13 billion. It sounds tiny. And 4.8 billion sounds small compared to the things like the debt and the U.S. budget. So I'd say about that amount.
All right, sounds good. We have an unclear upvoted question, but I think I know what this is getting at. The question or the statement is Jonah and the whale versus science, which I think the question is, how do you interpret, or what is your take on some of those more fantastic
I have never studied in depth the book of Jonah, so my opinions on this are ignorant and not authoritative. But I would say that keep in mind, it doesn't say a whale. It's a large fish. And so there's no reason to think he couldn't have been swallowed by some kind of a marine animal and that he died. When it talks about my soul went down to the pit, in the Old Testament, this is language for going to the realm of the dead, Sheol, which is the realm of the departed. And then when he's vomited up on land, he comes back to life. So I think he may well have been dead in the belly of the fish and then came back to life. And so Jesus uses Jonah as a symbol for himself. He says, as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And that involved, of course, a literal death on Jesus' part and then a resurrection. And in Jonah's case, it would be a literal death and then a revivification to the mortal life.
Maybe broadening the question out a bit, how do you interpret or navigate some of the more, let's say, miraculous stories in the Old Testament or things that you run across there versus, kind of a naturalistic perspective?
Well, my attitude is that if God exists, then miracles are trivial for him to perform. A miracle would be an event that doesn't have any naturalistic explanation, but is immediately wrought by God. And if there is a God who is able to create the entire universe out of nothing and design it with an incomprehensible precision for life, well, as Peter Slezak, an Australian philosopher, put it in his debate with me, the odd resurrection would be child's play for such a God. So I don't have any trouble believing miracles in the Bible.
Fantastic. All right. A culturally relevant question here, given all the recent things happening. How do you respond to UFO questions, given our Christian belief?
I think that intellectually, I don't have any theological objection to there being intelligent extraterrestrial life out there. The Bible is written to human beings on the planet Earth, detailing our plan of salvation. And if God has created intelligent extraterrestrials elsewhere, I'm sure he loves them and has an appropriate plan of salvation for them as well. And so I don't have any problem intellectually or theologically with there being intelligent life forms that God has created elsewhere. And notice I say that God has created, because we've already seen that the origin of life anywhere in the universe by chance alone is astronomically improbable. So it would need to be something that God has done elsewhere as he has done here. Now, I say that intellectually, but honestly, I have to say, John, when I began to hear some of these recent news reports saying that they have found the body of an extraterrestrial and that the Pentagon has got this, and able to display it, I must say it gave me chills, because I thought, if next Tuesday they really did trot out the carcass of an extraterrestrial visitor to Earth, I think this would be, humanly speaking, the greatest event in human history. Not theologically speaking, but humanly speaking. What would be more incredible that we would find other intelligent life forms like ourselves in the cosmos? So emotionally, I think it would have an incredible impact if we were to actually discover such life forms.
Okay. Fantastic. A much more classical question here. How does a loving God allow evil? How would you answer this one?
Whoa, boy. Now, this is such a huge question. We could spend hours on it. And anything I would say.
We got 45 seconds.
Yeah, in soundbite is just going to appear inadequate. But let me just say a couple of things. It's really important to distinguish between the intellectual question and the emotional question. The intellectual question is, how can an all-loving and all-powerful God permit evil and suffering in the world? The emotional question is, how do you dissolve people's emotional dislike of a God who would allow them to suffer so? These are two entirely different questions, and the answer to one is not a good answer to the other. I think for most people, it's really an emotional problem. They've never really thought it through intellectually. Intellectually, it is virtually impossible to prove that it is either impossible or highly improbable that an all-loving, all-powerful God could not permit evil and suffering in the world. That places a burden of proof on the atheist's shoulders that is unsustainable. And so I don't think that intellectually there is a good statement of the problem of evil. No one has been able to show that given God's existence, the evil in the world is either impossible or highly improbable. Now, if you want to see that laid out in detail, take a look at a little book that I wrote called Hard Questions, Real Answers, where it has a couple of chapters on the problem of suffering and evil.
Great. So something that's also relevant is, the very in vogue thing I think I've seen on TikTok, the deconstructing your faith movement, whatever that means specifically.
Yeah.
But how would you respond to folks who say that they feel better after doing that?
I think how you feel is irrelevant. I could well imagine that some people who have been really struggling with Christian faith would feel real relieved about letting it go. But that doesn't determine truth. Feelings are very deceptive and misleading. The question is, what is the truth? And I am not in the least interested in deconstructing someone's faith. I'm interested in constructing a Christian world and life view that is biblically coherent and in accord with the best philosophical, scientific, historical, psychological facts that we know. And so I think the whole project of building a Christian world and life view is one of construction, not deconstruction. And these people who are deconstructing, I suspect, are just reacting emotionally to bad experiences they've had in the institutional church.
Yeah, I mean, given the pervasiveness of this on social media and other things, I mean, do you have any kind of ideas or thoughts on root causes or how this has gained traction?
From what I've been told from people who do have more experience with this, is that these folks tend to come out of very conservative Christian churches that have been authoritarian, and they have often had negative emotional experiences in the church that have left them hurt and damaged, and they're reacting against that. And as I say, following emotions is not the way to get at truth. That is deceptive and misleading. And so I guess what I would want to do is not so much criticize them. I mean, we can have compassion on them for what they're doing. But I want to present an alternative, more glorious vision, namely a vision of constructing a Christian world and life view that makes sense of reality and is biblically consistent. I think that positive, glorious project is one that can capture a person's imagination and help to free him from these emotional things that would drag him back down.
Thank you. We have a few questions about evolution from your lecture tonight.
Yeah.
Could you talk about a couple of things? One, could you talk a little bit about microevolution, and do you think that is supported, or is that mutually exclusive with the Bible? And then secondly, just evolution in general. Do you think that the Big Bang implies evolution and is mutually exclusive with Christianity? And what's some thoughts there?
Okay, well, let's start at the end. The Big Bang Theory is about the origin of the universe, so it says nothing about how life originated on this planet. So you could believe in the Big Bang Theory, the origin of the universe, and then believe that around 10 to 20,000 years ago, in 6 24-hour days, God created life on this planet. But I think that there is very, very powerful evidence that there is a history of life on this planet. That life began some 4 billion years ago as single-celled bacteria. And for about 2 billion years or so, that's all there was this single-celled bacteria. You might think, well, why would God allow that to occur? Well, all during that time, this bacteria is performing photosynthesis. And as a result, it is stocking the atmosphere with oxygen for 2 billion years. So that the oxygen in the earth is prepared then for air-breathing animals, terrestrial life, to then come onto the life. And that's exactly what we find then. First primitive life, and then more and more sophisticated life, the age of the dinosaurs, the mammals, finally humanity. There is a history of life on this planet that seems to me undeniable. Now, the question would be, how are these life forms related to each other or one another? Were there acts of God's creation along the way where he created out of nothing new animals without any kind of ancestors? Or did he, in some way, do acts such that these animals were transformed into different creatures, so that he used the stuff that was already there to produce new life forms? And I think either one is possible, but I find it very difficult to believe in this kind of creation out of nothing that doesn't take place at the beginning, but takes place kind of like all the way along the line. So, for example, I was talking to a young earth creationist once, and I said, on your view, is it that there was a still prehistoric pond, and then all of a sudden, out of nothing, poof, there was a duck swimming on the surface of the pond? And he said, yeah, that's basically it, except one duck wouldn't be enough. You'd have to have a whole family of ducks. Right, so they could breed, right? And to me, that sounds more like magic than the God of the Bible. And especially when you think about the dinosaurs, are we really to imagine that just poof, a 50-ton brachiosaurus came out of, a family of them came out of nothing and appeared on the earth? That just seems incredible. So when I look at the miracles in the Bible, I don't see miracles of creation out of nothing except at the beginning. Even, for example, when Jesus turned water into wine, do you notice he first had them fill the jars with water? He didn't create the wine out of nothing in the jars. They filled the jars with water, and then the water was transformed into wine. And so I am more inclined to the view that God has superintended the history of life so as to not do works of absolute creation out of nothing periodically, but to bring new life forms out of previous life forms until we get to today. And I suspect, as I said in my talk, that apart from divine providential supervision, that this would never have happened.
One pushback that I've heard on this is that this is kind of straddling the line in a way.
Yes.
How would you respond to that? Where it's like,
Well, I don't think that straddling the line is a bad thing. If it's a moderate position that avoids extremes. The extremes would be creation out of nothing The other extreme would be unguided, unsupervised evolution by pure chance. And the straddling the line would be to say evolutionary development supervised and providentially ordered by a transcendent creator of the universe who intended this from the beginning. And it seems to me that that's a plausible middle way.
Great, thank you. What would you say, either through your speaking engagements that you do, or through your different social media channels? What's the most common question or argument you get from your average person?
Yeah.
And how do you answer it? Do you have any?
If I were to say, probably the most common thing is there's no evidence for God. People in our culture rarely meet Christians who are able to give good reasons for why they believe in God. And so the average non-believer thinks that we just believe by a blind leap of faith in the dark, no matter what the evidence says. And so it is very common for them to assume that atheism is the default position. They just fold their arms and play the skeptic and say, there's no good evidence for God. And most Christians have nothing to say at that point. So I think that's the most common response. And so if you've got a few good arguments under your belt, you can look at that person with wide eyes and open mouth and say, is that what you think? Well, I can think of at least 3 good arguments for God's existence. And at that point, they've got to say, yeah, like what? And then you're off and running and you begin sharing your apologetic arguments.
And every single person who's been at this class for the last 8 weeks will be able to do that. There's a test on your way out. There's a test. You asked, what do you mean by that? That's right, exactly. Speaking of Genesis, there's a question on why do you think that Genesis is ambiguous, or do you think God was intentionally ambiguous with the Genesis account? Can you
That's a good question. I don't think it's a matter of ambiguity. I think it's a matter of the literary genre or the literary type. The Bible is filled with different kinds of literature. There's poetry in the Psalms. There's history in the Acts of the Apostles. There's biography in the Gospels. There is epistolary literature in the letters of Paul. There is apocalyptic literature in the book of Revelation. And the principles of literary interpretation of these different kinds of literature vary from genre to genre or type to type. For example, it would be an enormous mistake to interpret the book of Revelation literally, that there are going to be beasts and multi-headed monsters coming up out of the ocean and taking over the earth. Everybody recognizes that these are symbols of nation states and political alliances and things. Or to interpret the poetry of the Psalms literally would be a huge mistake when the psalmist says, let the trees of the wood clap their hands before the Lord. He doesn't think that trees have got hands. This is poetry. Now, in exactly the same way, I think that the first 11 chapters of Genesis belong to a type of literature that is figurative. It's not that it's ambiguous, it's that it's figurative. It uses imagery and metaphor to communicate these deep truths, such as that God is the sole creator of everything else, the source of life, and that all these other things are not gods to be worshiped. They're just stuff that God has made. That's the underlying message in the first chapter.
All right, we've got time, I think, for 2 more. We'll ask 2 more questions. How would you say you move or can move someone from a theistic position where they believe there's a creator to Christianity?
Okay, great.
What do you think that bridge
We
is?
haven't talked about that at all tonight. I did my doctoral work in Germany on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And I was shocked to discover that the facts undergirding the resurrection of Jesus are held by the wide majority of New Testament historians today, whether conservative or liberal or non-Christian. And these would be principally three in number. That after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb, and that tomb was found empty by a group of Jesus' women followers on the first day of the week after the crucifixion. Secondly, that thereafter various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. And thirdly, that the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Now, those are the facts. The only question is, how do you best explain them? And I would argue that when you assess different explanations by the standard criteria that historians use, like explanatory power, explanatory scope, simplicity, and so forth, that by far the resurrection hypothesis, the explanation the original disciples gave, comes out head and shoulders above the alternatives. And that means that the God whom Jesus had allegedly blasphemed has publicly and dramatically vindicated those allegedly blasphemous claims for which he was crucified. And so I think on the basis of the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, we have very sound historical grounds for believing that Jesus was who he claimed to be, and therefore that Christian theism is true.
And so to move someone from theism to Christianity, you would present them with the evidence for Jesus, essentially.
Yes, I would point them to the person of Jesus of Nazareth, his personal claims and his resurrection from the dead in vindication of those claims.
All right, last question, and to close out the night, you mentioned there was this perceived split, or this split that happened between Christianity and science, or religion and science that happened, I think you mentioned 100 years ago. It still is pretty strong today, in a way, at least among the general population. Do you have a thought on why that is, and do you think that gap will close, or what's your thesis on science and religion, or science and Christianity in the future?
It certainly is true, John, that the so-called new atheists, like Richard Dawkins and his ilk, did champion this sort of antiquated 19th century scientism that Andrew Dixon White propagated. And so it did come roaring back into popular culture through the efforts of the new atheists. But that now seems to have passed. I think that is eclipsed. The new atheists like Dawkins were roundly denounced by their scientific and philosophical colleagues at the university, despite their popular cultural influence. Their colleagues were blistering in their criticisms. And so I think that is now beginning to fade.
Great. Well, everyone, that concludes our night. We want to get you out on time. Thank you, Dr. Craig.